The water was like ink, still and endless, reflecting nothing but the black void above. I stood at the edge of Black Hollow Lake, my feet sinking into the soft mud, the cold seeping through my toes. Jason was the first to step in, his laughter cutting through the heavy silence. "See? Just a stupid legend," he scoffed, his voice echoing across the water. He turned to us, his grin wide and mocking. But before any of us could respond, something yanked him under. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, the surface of the lake closing over him as if he had never existed. We froze, the four of us who remained staring at the spot where Jason had disappeared. The water was unnaturally still, not a ripple to suggest he had been there at all. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as if trying to escape the dread that was settling over me. "Jason!" Emily called, her voice trembling. She took a step forward, her hand outstretched as if she could pull him back from the depths. "This isn't funny, Jason." But there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest around us. The fog had rolled in earlier, thick and heavy, clinging to the trees and the surface of the lake. It made everything feel distant, unreal, as if we were trapped in a dream or a nightmare. I wanted to believe this was some kind of prank, that Jason would burst out of the water any second, laughing at how easily he had fooled us. But deep down, I knew better. The stories about Black Hollow Lake weren't just stories. They were warnings, passed down through generations, whispered in hushed tones by those who had lived long enough to know better. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My words seemed to break the spell that had fallen over us, and the others nodded, their faces pale in the dim light of the moon. But as we turned to leave, a sound stopped us in our tracks. A low, guttural groan, like the creak of old wood or the rumble of distant thunder. It came from the lake, and it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. Emily let out a choked sob, clutching at my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What the hell was that?" Mark demanded, his voice sharp with fear. He was the skeptic of the group, the one who had insisted on coming here tonight to prove the legends wrong. But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his hands as he took a step back from the water's edge. I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that we needed to leave now. But as I turned to run, something caught my eye. A faint ripple on the surface of the lake, moving toward the shore. The ripple grew larger, closer, until it was right in front of us. And then, with a sudden violent splash, Jason's head broke the surface. He gasped for air, his eyes wide and wild, his hands clawing at the water as if something was still holding him down. "Help me!" he screamed, his voice raw and desperate. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing his arm and pulling with all my strength. But it was like trying to lift a boulder. He was impossibly heavy, as if the lake itself was trying to keep him. Mark and Emily rushed to help, grabbing Jason's other arm and pulling with me. For a moment, it seemed like we might actually get him out. But then, with a force that knocked us all backward, Jason was dragged under again, his scream cut off as the water closed over him. This time, he didn't resurface. We stared at the spot where he had been, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, our minds struggling to process what had just happened. "We have to go," Emily said, her voice shaking. "We have to go now." She was right, of course, but none of us could move. We were rooted to the spot, our eyes fixed on the lake, waiting for something, anything to happen. The fog seemed to thicken around us, wrapping us in a cold, damp embrace. The silence was unbearable, pressing down on us like a physical weight. And then, from somewhere deep within the lake, came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, mournful wail, like the cry of a lost soul. That sound broke the spell. We turned and ran, our feet slipping in the mud, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out to snag at our clothes and hair. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, but I could feel the lake behind us, its presence like a malevolent force, watching, waiting. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, our lungs burning, our legs trembling with exhaustion. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them twice before finally getting the door open. We piled in, not caring about the mud and water we were tracking onto the seats. Mark started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life, a small comfort in the suffocating silence. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness, but I kept glancing at it, half expecting to see something, someone following us. Emily was crying quietly in the back seat, her face buried in her hands. Mark's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might break. None of us spoke. What was there to say? When we finally reached the safety of Mark's house, we sat in the car for a long time, none of us willing to be the first to move. The night seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, as if the lake had followed us home. Eventually, we forced ourselves to go inside, locking the doors behind us and turning on every light in the house. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me like a second skin. The next few days passed in a blur. We reported Jason's disappearance, of course, but the police didn't take us seriously. They said we were just kids, scared and confused, that Jason had probably run off on his own. They searched the lake, but they didn't find anything. How could they? The lake didn't give up its secrets easily. I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jason's face, his eyes wide with terror as he was dragged under. I heard his screams, the sound of them echoing in my mind, a constant reminder of what had happened. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was drowning in my own fear, just as surely as Jason had drowned in the lake. Emily and Mark weren't doing any better. Emily had stopped coming to school, and when I called her, she wouldn't say much, just that she couldn't stop thinking about it. Mark had become withdrawn, his usual confidence replaced by a hollow emptiness. We were all broken in our own ways, and I didn't know how to fix it. A week after Jason's disappearance, I had a dream. I was back at the lake, standing at the water's edge, the fog thick around me. The surface of the lake was perfectly still, like a mirror, reflecting the pale light of the moon. And then, slowly something began to rise from the depths, a hand pale and lifeless, fingers stretching toward the shore. I woke up screaming, my heart pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat. The dream stayed with me, haunting my every waking moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something, that the lake wasn't done with us yet. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, that it didn't mean anything, but deep down I knew better. The lake had claimed Jason, and it wasn't going to stop there. A few days later, Emily called me, her voice trembling. I saw him, she said, her words barely audible. I saw Jason. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He was in my room, she whispered. He was standing there, just staring at me. And then, he was gone. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her it was just her imagination, that she was just stressed and scared. But I couldn't, because I had seen him too, in the corner of my room, in the shadows, just for a moment. And then he was gone, like he had never been there at all. Mark called me the next day, his voice hollow. I can't do this anymore, he said. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay. I'm going back to the lake. I have to know what happened to him. I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. He was determined, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. I went with him, of course. I couldn't let him go alone. Emily refused to come, and I didn't blame her. The thought of going back to that place filled me with a dread so deep, it was almost paralyzing. But I couldn't let Mark face it alone. The lake was just as I remembered it, dark, still, and eerily silent. The fog was thick, clinging to the trees and the water, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. Mark walked straight to the water's edge, his movements stiff and mechanical, like he was in a trance. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. Jason! Mark called, his voice echoing across the water. Jason, where are you? There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Mark stepped into the water, his shoes sinking into the mud. Mark, don't, I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't listen. He kept walking, the water rising to his knees, then his waist. And then, just like with Jason, something yanked him under. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, the surface of the lake closing over him as if he had never existed. I stared at the spot where he had been, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the water, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then slowly, something began to rise from the depths. A hand, pale and lifeless, fingers stretching toward the shore. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, and then finally, a head. It was Mark. His eyes wide and unseeing, his skin pale and waxy. He was dead. There was no doubt about that. But he was moving, crawling out of the water, his movements stiff and unnatural. I turned and ran, my feet slipping in the mud, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, but I could hear him behind me. His footsteps heavy and slow, his breath rasping in his throat. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I drove away as fast as I could, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I couldn't go home, not with Mark, or whatever Mark had become following me. I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. I ended up at Emily's house. She took one look at me and knew something was wrong. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling. I told her everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She listened in silence, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. We have to go back, she said when I was finished. We have to end this. I wanted to argue, to tell her it was too dangerous, but I knew she was right. We couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. We had to face the lake, face whatever was in it, and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. We went back the next night, armed with nothing but flashlights and our own determination. The lake was just as I remembered it, dark, still, and eerily silent. The fog was thick, clinging to the trees and the water, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. We stood at the water's edge, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that we had to do something, anything to end this. And then, slowly, something began to rise from the depths, a hand pale and lifeless, fingers stretching toward the shore. It was Mark, his eyes wide and unseeing, his skin pale and waxy. He was dead. There was no doubt about that. But he was moving, crawling out of the water, his movements stiff and unnatural. Emily screamed, her voice echoing across the water. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on Mark, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, slowly something began to rise from the depths. A hand, pale and lifeless, fingers stretching toward the shore. It was Jason, his eyes wide and unseeing, his skin pale and waxy. He was dead, there was no doubt about that. But he was moving, crawling out of the water, his movements stiff and unnatural. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Emily was screaming, her voice raw and desperate. But I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as Jason and Mark crawled out of the water, their eyes fixed on us, their movements slow and deliberate. And then, with a sudden violent lurch, they were on us, their hands cold and clammy, their grip impossibly strong. I struggled, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but it was no use. They were too strong, too determined. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Emily's face, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then there was nothing, only darkness, cold and endless, pressing down on me from all sides. When I woke up, I was in the water, the cold biting through my skin, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I could see the surface above me, the pale light of the moon filtering through the water. But no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't reach it. And then, slowly, something began to rise from the depths. A hand, pale and lifeless, fingers stretching toward me. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. All I could do was watch as the hand closed around my wrist, pulling me down into the darkness, where I would remain forever.